All right. How's everybody? Welcome back. Today's Monday, February 12th. Sorry for the delay in getting this video to you. We had several school cancellations in a row last week. As you may or may not know, I think you do, even though a lot of you, are caveat students, and of course your high schools got canceled, and we don't meet in person, obviously. But the practical difficulty that caused for me was my work computer is the one I like to record on. My home computer does not deliver good outputs, and often just gets scrambled and I have to redo it 6 times. So I gave myself permission to wait till today to upload the video on Dworkin on Dementia by Rebecca Dresser. And that's what you're watching now. And I will make the discussion board very manageable and doable. Um, yeah, so there'll still be a discussion board, but maybe not quite as thorough as I originally intended, just because I don't want you to get behind. You're going to have some new material to deal with this week as well. Okay, so let's just dive in. So we've been looking at the value or the principle of autonomy in healthcare. Basic idea being that any patient who is capable of making medical decisions on their own should be allowed to do so. And this push for autonomy has kind of replaced the more traditional paternalistic mode of thinking in healthcare. One of the interesting things that can one of the more interesting sorts of cases to deal with, though, involves people who can no longer make competent decisions for themselves. So, what one has to do is either figure out who would be the best surrogate decision maker. A surrogate decision maker is one who makes decisions on the patient's behalf, or perhaps the patient had already written what is called an advance directive. So an advance directive is a legal document where the patient will write what they would like to see happen to them if they were to develop a range of illnesses. So the person in the Dworkin reading that the dresser is talking about is Margot. And we'll backtrack to her in a second, but she had an advance directive. So now the question becomes, should we follow it? And it's a tricky case because in some ways, Margot seems to have a very good life indeed. And in other ways, she's living a life I think most of us would prefer to avoid. And her own advance directive uh, kind of stated a preference for doctor-assisted suicide. Uh, as you know, helping someone take their own life under any condition is a serious matter. So it raises a lot of prospects uh, for reflection, for disagreements. So Dworkin is going to defend the view that we should follow Margot's advance directive, and Dresser is going to criticize Dworkin's view. The part of the text I had you read, though, was more Dresser capturing Dworkin's line of thinking. I thought that was enough for one go around in the reading and for an assignment. Um, so as I talk, I'll give you some of Dresser's responses to Dworkin to kind of fill in the rest of the article a bit. Okay, so let's proceed. Ideally, you would have your own answers to these reading questions in front of you. And I did read them online, and for a few of you, I said, pretty good, but you might want to watch the video and make sure you're understanding things correctly. Most of you did actually quite well, though, and all of you did quite well on most of the questions. But yeah, it's still worth reviewing. Okay, so the first question, In the second paragraph of this reading, Dresser notes that Ronald Dworkin's book discusses three groups of people in relation to the decision to hasten death. Uh, so, what were those three groups? Well, they were people who are mentally competent, but who have a serious illness. So, picture someone with late stage cancer or something like that. Expected life expectancy not very long, maybe a lot of pain involved. People who are permanently unconscious. So, in everyday parlance, not sure if this is a great term to use, but we often refer to such persons in a vegetable state. So, typically, persons hooked up to life prolonging technology, breathing machines, feeding tubes, but they're irreversibly comatose and they're never going to regain consciousness. And finally, there are people who are conscious but they're not mentally competent. So maybe due to Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, maybe due to a brain tumor, maybe just due to the ravages of old age. They're conscious, they're aware, they have thoughts, feelings, but their ability to understand is diminished, and their ability to make rational choices on their own behalf is diminished. Of these three groups, Dresser, this is question 1B, Dresser will respond to Dworkin's thoughts about euthanasia in relation to which group? Well, it's going to be that last group I mentioned, people who are conscious but not mentally competent. Now, the word euthanasia actually means good death. The idea there is a person will take their life in order to prevent um, ongoing living with much pain and suffering. We're going to do another article on active and passive euthanasia this week. Um, Active euthanasia is where the doctor assists in the death, perhaps by administering poison. And then passive euthanasia would be if a person simply forgoes medical care and lets nature take its course. Passive euthanasia is largely uncontroversial. A lot of the debate surrounds active euthanasia, and that's what gets discussed in this article. Okay. On page 32, Margot is discussed. So your task was to describe Margot's life and abilities. So some essential points. She's capable of simple pleasures, listening to music, talking with people, reading a book. She has short-term memory loss, though. So she could read a book, put it down, pick it up a little later, read the exact same passage. And to her, it would feel like she hasn't read it before. So she has a very time-sliced life, very episodic, doesn't have a rich sense of the context in which she's living. Like, for example, what family members are alive, which are deceased, who her friends are. She can't really identify a lot of people anymore. So she's basically content and happy. Like if you were to interact with her, she presents as having positive emotive states, but she doesn't have a lot of psychological depth or continuity. So that's what you were trying to capture in your three sentence descriptions. Now, question 1D says, do you think Margot is living a good life that is worth preserving by combating lethal illness? Now, of course, it's probably Margot's view that's the most important here, but I just wanted to ask this question to get you to see the answer would involve a lot of tension. So, if on the one hand you're focusing on is Margot enjoying her life, the answer seems to be yes. She seems to be very content, very at peace, very safe. She's getting good care. She's surrounded by people who are nice to her. So on that level, yeah. good life. But on another level, not a good life. She's not, again, she has no psychological continuity through time. She doesn't have a lot of memories of connections to people who are important to her. She can't really identify people, even if she's seeing them every day. So it's like a very simple in the moment sort of pleasure. There's not a lot of depth or deeper meaning or sense of oneself through time. In that sense, it's a life I don't think any of us would choose. Like if you could snap your fingers and be like, would you trade your current life for that life? I'm guessing you would say no. Um, but again, it's still a contented, somewhat joyful life. So there's tension in how you could answer that question. Um, okay, on to question two. So in the last paragraph, page 32, we see Dworkin's discussion of Margot. So Dresser is quoting Dworkin. He has us imagine that Margot has written an advance directive before her Alzheimer's had begun to deteriorate her mental life. So it is hypothetical. This wasn't, there was no Margot who had actually written an advance directive. So Dworkin is just kind of adding that in for discussion. So what sorts of medical interventions did Margot specify in her advance directive that she wanted to reject? That's question 2A and 2B. Under what conditions would Margot even want to be killed? So that would be active euthanasia. So Margot specified that she did not want treatment for any serious or life-threatening diseases. So that's in her, that general rejection is in her advance directive. So Margot was already reasonably advanced in age, and she did not want to. Now, just picture what it would mean for the advance directive to even kick in. That would mean she had already lost her ability to make competent medical decisions for herself. So she'd have to specify ahead of time, okay, if my mental capacity is diminished to a point where I can no longer make those decisions, I don't want to fight too hard to preserve that sort of life. So any life-threatening illness, she doesn't want treatment for it. And then Dworkin has us hypothesize that Margot even has requested to be killed painlessly and swiftly if she were to develop Alzheimer's. Okay. Now, question 3 invites us to consider Dworkin's view on whether or not this advance directive should be followed. Now, Dworkin thinks it should be. So just reading from question 3, Dworkin has a theory that entails Margot's prior wishes expressed in the advance directive should be followed, even though she is now enjoying her life. So let's look at that theory. So questions 3 and 3B get at Dworkin's key distinction. He distinguishes a person's experiential interests from their critical interests. So 3A and B just kind of have you define those. Okay, so experiential are these kind of simpler, episodic, or in the moment pleasures that even like a small child could partake in. Uh, Playing a sport, reading a book, painting a picture, listening to music, going for a walk, maybe having a conversation. These are all experiential in the moment pleasures or interests. Because we enjoy them, we have an interest in experiencing them, hence the word experiential interests. Okay, critical interests. These are kind of like our underlying set of values, life plans, goals that kind of structure for us what we think of as a good life, a meaningful life, one worth pursuing. So one's critical interests are more reflective, they're more big picture, they're kind of the framework one has for evaluating and deciding on the life they would like to lead. Now, question 3C asks, which does Dworkin consider more important? And Dworkin argues that it's our critical interests that are more important. And you can kind of see why that might be. Um, First of all, it's the uniquely human and therefore humanizing set of characteristics. Presumably, dogs or elephants or dolphins, they don't have a robust set of values that endure through time and cause them to make choices, pursue different goals, relationships, professions. Humans are the only species that has that set of capacities. And historically, and perhaps also at present, we tend to value our humanity as being somehow special based on those critical interests. So Dworkin uses that sort of consideration to argue that those are more important than the experiential interests. Now, it's not obvious that he's right about this. If a person was thoroughly deprived of their experiential interests and still had the critical ones, they still might have a very severely um, just a bad life, right? So the experiential interests are a huge part of what makes up a good life. So if one wanted to push back on Dworkin, one might argue, yeah, they're roughly equally balanced. Sure, one is a little more has a little more depth to it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's more important. So that would be the counter argument. Okay, now, uh, so question D, do you agree or disagree? So we've laid out some reasons for agreeing and some reasons for disagreeing. All right, 3E, which type of interest can Margot still experience? Clearly, that's the experiential interests. She reads books, she paints, she has pleasant conversation, takes naps, goes for walks. Again, she just doesn't really remember she's done it a few minutes later. Very episodic, but she still enjoys those activities and still has an interest in enjoying those activities. Now, question 1F. So in the first paragraph of the middle column, Dworkin talks about the critical interests we have when approaching death. What is that interest? And that interest is to die in a manner that kind of reflects their value system. So let's say you were a deeply religiously convicted person who thought life was a gift and did not think you had the freedom to maybe choose to end your life early. Then you might be against euthanasia in all its forms, at least for yourself, if not for everybody. And you would maybe kind of suffer through to the end. Um, if you had a different set of values, so Margot's value system says, well, if I'm living a life that seems a little bit too animalish, a little bit subhuman, um, I don't want to live that life. So that was in her advanced directive. Now, this is important because Dworkin is going to say, look, there was a time when Margot had both critical interests and experiential interests. And at that time, she had a perspective on her own life that allowed her to decide how she wanted to end her life. But now that she has only experiential interests and her critical thinking capacities are diminished, she can't really make that sort of choice for herself anymore. So Dworkin thinks that our biggest interest as we approach the end of life isn't enjoying those last few moments. It's living in a way that reflects our overall enduring set of values, even if those values haven't been present for that last stretch due to illness, mental illness. Okay. Um, all right. So question 4. In the next paragraph, Dworkin discusses how autonomy and beneficence should apply to Margot. An argument in favor of valuing a person's autonomy is stated. This is labeled the evidentiary view of autonomy. So questions A and B. So question A, what is the evidentiary argument for valuing a person's autonomy? And so the idea here is that each person is the expert on how their life should be lived. They know the most about themselves, their own values, conditions under which they flourish, conditions under which they suffer, what they find meaningful, what they can and cannot handle. So the evidence they have for what life they ought to live is greater than the evidence anyone else could have, because only they have an insider's perspective on their own life. So that's called the evidentiary argument for autonomy. Just historically, it goes back to this book called On Liberty by J.S. Mill. Yeah, that's just side point. Now, there's another view of autonomy. This is called the integrity view. The idea here is respect for other people requires letting them make their own decisions, even if those decisions are often bad decisions. Okay. So we've all heard and used the phrase, "It's my life." Why are you trying to tell me how to live my life? I get to live it how I want. So this is this more integrity-based view of autonomy. Doesn't matter if I'm right or wrong. I get to make the choices because the choices are primarily about me, not you. So I'm going to go ahead and make them. All right. Now, question 4C. Dworkin uses the integrity view of autonomy to argue that one should follow Margot's advance directive. 4C, why does he not use the evidentiary view to make his argument? Now, this is actually kind of a fascinating, the answer is actually kind of fascinating. Even though Margot was an expert on what it was like to live as Margot before her capacities diminished, since she never experienced life with diminished capacities, living only in the moment, forgetting and starting over, she wasn't an expert in what it would be like to live that sort of life. So you can't say of Margot, well, she knew best whether or not she would flourish in that sort of post-Alzheimer life where she lives strictly in the moment. So Dworkin denies that Margot had good evidence regarding whether or not she would actually appreciate that sort of life. So he lets the evidentiary argument for autonomy go in the case of Margot. He doesn't press it because he thinks it doesn't apply. What does apply, he says, is respecting Margot's critical interests, whether or not they were well informed or not. They still were her interests, and she still has this basic right to live out her life in accord with the interests and with the values and with in accord with the judgments she made, kind of like in her prime, so to speak. Okay, so that's the thinking there. Okay, question 5. In the last paragraph of page 33, Dworkin gives a beneficence-based argument for following the advance directive. What does he think is best for Margot and why? Now, this question's supposed to be a little tricky because remember, Margot's actually enjoying her life in her Alzheimer's state. Lots of pleasant experiences throughout the day. See, one might think to be beneficent to promote Margot's well-being, what one should do is let those pleasant life experiences continue. But Dworkin doesn't think so. He thinks people benefit the most when we respect their deepest set of values, which involves their critical interests. Remember, your critical interests are that set of values by which you choose your overall pattern of living, the character and identity you want to form, um, religious identity, vocational identity, just who you are in the world, how you relate to other people, friends, partners, children, if you so choose. And he thinks that we benefit others by respecting their values and letting them live out those values. And that's why he thinks it's actually compassionate to follow Margot's advanced directive and engage in what is called assisted suicide or active euthanasia. Okay. As we transition to the discussion board, I'm more or less going to ask you if you agree with Dworkin. You're Margot's doctor. You see her every day. Um, she's in good physical health. She is enjoying life. But back when she had her full set of capacities, she made it clear she wouldn't want to live that sort of life. But yet, remember the arguments in regards to the evidentiary view of autonomy. Even Dworkin admits a person with their full set of capacities can't really imagine what it's like to have a diminished set. Um, so yeah, what would it mean to respect Margot's autonomy? And does autonomy trump beneficence? How do we understand beneficence in this case? These are all issues that we just went through in relation to the questions. So I'll give you a discussion board that kind of revolves around those themes so we can pursue this discussion further. All right, so I think that'll wrap up this week's video. And yeah, I'll check in with you next week.